What does human flourishing mean to you?
Yes, it's the question reminds me of the question addressed to Louis Armstrong by a reporter. He said, "Mr. Armstrong, can you define what jazz is?" And he says, "If you have to ask, you're never going to know." And flourishing is some kind of like that, in that it is what people strive for, it is what they want, it's what they choose if given the freedom to do so. At least if they were in the frame of thinking of the long-term course of their lives, because we all are faced with trade-offs between immediate pleasure, which I think we wouldn't call flourishing, and a deeper satisfaction over the course of our lives. I would add, I mean, there's something unsatisfying about the answer to the question being, well, just ask people and whatever they want. That's what flourishing must be. Because I think we can do a little bit better, and we could say, what do people tend toward when they do reflect over the course of their lives? What matters? And there, I think it often coincides with the prerequisites to having that conversation in the first place, to asking that question. And there are things like, well, most obviously, life. If we weren't alive, we couldn't even be having this conversation. We couldn't even consider the question, which in turn means health, because health is strongly related to the probability of being alive and not dying, but also nutrition and a certain degree of comfort. Since we are inherently social beings, we evolved by a process that's inherently social, namely sexual reproduction. So the fact that you exist means that you are the end of a lineage of people who found mates and had sex and probably were in love if they were able to bring up children. So you got love and human connection. If you're pondering it, well, you had to have been in a community that had language, so you must have been because no one can invent a language by themselves, so you're part of a community. You also must have a certain amount of education in the sense of that question even making sense to you. So a lot of the things that I think we would identify as essential to flourishing are not only things that people tend to opt for, but also things that are prerequisite to them being alive and healthy and social and educated enough even to have the conversation.
All right, thank you. Tyler, human flourishing.
I think a lot of resonance with what Steve said. The working definition we've been using at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard is that flourishing is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, so very all-encompassing, but not all that helpful in practice, given the wide scope of it, and also complicated, because how that is understood, what is considered good, is going to vary to a certain extent by culture and tradition. And so what we've tried to do at the Human Flourishing program is to focus on what seems in common across different traditions, different cultures. And so what I would argue is that whatever else might be involved in human flourishing, the following 5 domains of human life would be at least part of any reasonable conception. And the list doesn't look all that different from Steve's. Happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Our argument's not that this exhausts what human flourishing is, but each, I think, is a part of it. I think each of those things is an end in and of itself. It's sought for its own sake, not merely a means to other ends. And each is nearly universally desired, and we have some empirical data on this as well. And I think those 2 criteria, being an end, being nearly universally desired, might help shape consensus around how to approach this topic. There's a great deal of consensus that we ought to promote health, that we ought to promote economic well-being, and I think those things are essential. But I think we can often attain a broader consensus in society to include things like meaning and like relationships, like happiness, and that it's worthwhile to do so. So I think that's a good starting point, but as I said, I think any given understanding of a flourishing life is going to move beyond that, is going to be yet more full, get richer still. And so for much of the world's population, one has some sort of notion of religious or spiritual well-being. And I think it's difficult to navigate these questions in the context of a pluralistic society because those understandings do differ. I think if one were to try to assess progress that each of these communities sees themselves as making towards their own religious or spiritual ends, it would require tradition-specific assessment. So it's not particularly straightforward. And I think within the Christian understanding of well-being or flourishing, that spiritual well-being is some sort of final communion with God. And sort of Thomas Aquinas' understanding in various parts of the Christian tradition, that's seen as kind of a final vision or understanding of God imparted by God himself. That may seem very abstract, but to try to make it more concrete, I mean, one can imagine the joy of proving a mathematical theorem or solving some difficult problem, or alternatively, the joy of listening to an organ fugue by Bach or whatever else your favorite music is, or the joy of encountering a long-lost friend after a lengthy absence. And if you imagine all those joys kind of brought together, the intellectual, the emotional, the relational, and then amplified by 100-fold, I'd say that's still a poor description of the sort of the final Christian vision of what true flourishing is, that final communion with God.